The mist hangs heavy over the hills, a thick, damp blanket clinging to the ancient, weathered stones of what you now know as Britain. The air is cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and distant wood smoke. It is the late Bronze Age, a time before the sharp clash of iron, when bronze, a precious alloy of copper and tin, was the metal of choice. The faint sounds of a community ripple through the stillness. A distant hammer against an anvil, the lowing of cattle, the soft murmur of voices around a hearth fire. These are the sounds of people who have lived here for generations, their ancestors having raised the very mounds that dot the landscape. Their world is one of small, self-sufficient groups living in round houses made of wattle and daub, their lives a rhythm of farming, hunting, and simple trade. Did you know that the Bronze Age people of Britain were master metal workers, creating intricate tools and weapons that were sought after far and wide? It's a quiet existence, built on a deep understanding of the land and its cycles, yet one that carries an undercurrent of something much older and more mysterious. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. In this deep past, there are no kings with crowns and castles. Instead, power and influence are held by chieftains and elders, their authority based on skill, wisdom, and the loyalty of their kin. They are the leaders of these small, localized tribes. Their names are lost to us, buried with their bones in barrows and burial mounds that still stand as silent sentinels across the countryside. These early groups weren't a single unified people. They were a patchwork of communities, each with its own customs and connections, linked by trade routes that crisscrossed the island. The exchange of bronze artifacts, amber from the Baltic, and even gold from Ireland tells us of a surprisingly connected world. The people are not yet known as Celts or Britons. Those names are a long way off. They simply exist, carving out a living in a land that feels both wild and profoundly familiar. It's a land where the rivers are the highways and the trackways, worn down by countless feet and hooves, are the arteries of their small world. It's a world without written history, a time we can only piece together from the things they left behind, their tools, their pottery, their monumental earthworks. These monuments, like the iconic Stonehenge, which was already ancient even to them, speak of a profound connection to the cosmos and the seasons. While historians still argue whether Stonehenge was primarily an astronomical calendar, a burial site, or a place of healing, its sheer scale suggests a level of organization and cooperation that went far beyond individual family groups. It required a collective effort, a shared purpose that brought people together from a vast area. The silent stones hold a secret that we will likely never fully understand, whispering of a society with a complex spiritual life and a deep reverence for their ancestors. The people who built them were not simple primitives. They were engineers, astronomers, and artists capable of great things. The tribes of this era practiced a form of ancestor worship, believing that the spirits of the dead remained connected to the land. Burial mounds were not just graves, they were sacred places, portals to another world, and a testament to the family's lineage and power. The rich tapestry of this belief system is hard to fully comprehend, but the physical evidence of their rituals is undeniable. As the Bronze Age drew to a close, subtle shifts began to occur. Climate change made farming more challenging, leading to greater competition for resources. This increased tension is reflected in the archaeological record, with more evidence of conflict, like fortified settlements and weapons designed for human combat. The soft hum of peaceful farming life was beginning to be replaced by a more cautious, guarded existence. The tribal structure that had served them so well was starting to strain under these new pressures. This was a time of transition, a slow and imperceptible turning of the page. The people themselves were changing, adapting, and preparing unknowingly for the next great wave of change. The ancient rhythms of their lives were about to be disrupted by new people with new ideas and a new, much harder metal. And so, the story of these ancient people begins to wind down, making way for the next chapter. The foundations they laid, however, would remain, buried deep beneath the earth, but a part of the landscape forever. The stories they never wrote down are whispered in the wind that rustles through the grass, a gentle reminder of who came before. These pre-Celtic peoples, who lived and died in a world we can only imagine, were the first to call this island home, and their legacy, though silent, is still felt in the very ground we walk upon. The whispers of the past, carried on the wind, soon began to mingle with the sound of new voices and the distant clatter of new tools. Around 800 BC, a profound change began to sweep across the continent and onto the island of Britain. This was the dawn of the Iron Age, marked by the arrival of a new material, and with it, new people, the Celts. The Celts were not a single unified group with a single leader and a single name. They were a diverse collection of tribes, bound by a shared language family, similar cultural practices, and a love for a brand new metal. Iron was a game changer. It was more readily available than the copper and tin needed for bronze, and it was stronger and more durable. The mastery of ironworking marked a new era of warfare, farming, and daily life. The new arrivals did not come as a single conquering army. Instead, their migration was a slow, steady flow of families and clans, settling alongside and eventually intermingling with the existing Bronze Age populations. This process of cultural exchange was gradual and complex. The new ways of life, from the construction of Hillforts to the intricate patterns of their art, slowly took root. The Hillforts, those vast earthworks that still scar the British landscape today, were not just military installations. They were also centers of trade, community, and political power. They were the strongholds of the new chieftains, places of refuge in a world that was becoming more competitive and more defined by tribal identity. The British tribes we would later come to know, the ones that would stand against the might of Rome, were forged in this period. Their names, the Druids, the Caravellani, the Iceni, began to emerge, each a distinct entity with its own territory and alliances. This was a time of dynamic change, where a new society was being built, layer by layer, upon the foundations of the old. It's an interesting thought that the very idea of a British identity as something separate from the continent began to form during these centuries. Their art, with its swirling curvilinear designs, is a reflection of their worldview. It's not a rigid, realistic art form. Instead, It's full of motion and energy, often incorporating abstract representations of animals and plants. This style, known as Latin, can be found on shields, torques, and other personal items, showing a love for intricate craftsmanship and a deep connection to the natural world. These patterns were not just decorative, they were often imbued with spiritual significance, meant to bring protection or good fortune. The society was hierarchical, with a warrior aristocracy, a class of free commoners, and a servile class. But at the heart of their society were two very important groups, the poets and the Druids. The poets, or bards, were the keepers of history, myth, and genealogy. They held immense power, for they controlled the stories that defined the tribe and its leaders. Their words could bring a chieftain glory or eternal shame. The Druids, however, were the most mysterious and influential. They were not just priests, they were judges, teachers, and healers. They held all the knowledge of tribal law, medicine, and religion. Their power was immense because they alone could communicate with the gods and interpret their will. They were the arbiters of justice, and their word was law. It's hard to overstate their importance. They were the glue that held the Celtic tribes together. Their religious practices were often tied to sacred groves, springs, and other natural sites. They performed rituals and sacrifices, both animal and some Roman accounts claim human. This is a point of scholarly debate, with historians still arguing whether the Roman accounts of human sacrifice were an exaggeration intended to justify their own conquest, or a factual, if sensationalized, representation of Celtic religious practices. Regardless, the Druids were a powerful force, and their influence stretched across tribal boundaries, creating a sense of a shared, pan-Celtic culture. This was a world in constant motion, of small-scale conflicts and shifting alliances. But it was also a world of deep-seated traditions and a rich oral culture. As the centuries passed, the various tribes of Britain became more distinct, with their own unique customs and political structures. In the south, tribes like the Catuvellauni and the Trinovantes began to consolidate power, creating larger kingdoms. Further north, in the rugged hills, the Brigantes were emerging as a formidable force. The stage was being set for a clash of cultures, though no one on the island could have possibly imagined the scale of what was coming. The whispers of the mainland were beginning to grow louder, bringing with them a different kind of power, one built on discipline, organization, and an ambition that the British tribes had never encountered. The world was about to get a whole lot smaller for the people of this island, and the age of their independence was ticking down, one beat at a time. The echoes of a different empire were just on the horizon, ready to cast a long, long shadow. From the patchwork of emerging tribes, one stood out as a particularly formidable force in the northern reaches of the island. They were known as the Brigantes, and their name, which likely meant high ones or hill dwellers, was well deserved. Their territory stretched from the misty eastern coast of what we now call Yorkshire all the way across to the western shores of Lancashire, covering much of modern-day northern England. This was no small tribe. It was a vast confederation of smaller clans and communities, bound together by a shared identity and a series of powerful leaders. At the heart of their society was a warrior aristocracy much like other Celtic tribes, but their sheer size and strategic location made them the dominant power in the region. They controlled crucial trade routes and valuable mineral deposits, giving them both wealth and influence far beyond their borders. The Brigantes were an enigma in many ways. While their power was undeniable, their internal politics were a constant source of tension. They were a loose confederation, not a single unified kingdom under a single monarch. This made them both resilient and vulnerable. When a strong leader was at the helm, the various clans worked together to repel invaders and project their power. But when there was a succession dispute or a charismatic rival emerged, the fragile alliance could splinter, turning former allies into bitter enemies. This internal turmoil would, as we will see, play a pivotal role in their ultimate fate. Their society was a complex web of familial ties, sworn allegiances, and strategic marriages. Like all Celtic societies, their warriors were highly respected, known for their fierce bravery and skill with a spear and shield. But it was their political acumen, or sometimes lack thereof, that truly defined their story. Their most famous leader was a woman named Cartimandua. Now, in a world dominated by male chieftains, a powerful queen is a fascinating anomaly, but female leaders were not unheard of among the Celts. Cartimandua ruled the Brigantes at a time when the Roman legions were beginning to cast a long shadow over the island. She initially adopted a pragmatic approach, choosing to be a client queen of the Roman Empire. This meant that she maintained her internal authority while aligning herself with Rome, a political tightrope act that was both clever and incredibly risky. For a time, it seemed to work. She and her husband, Venutius, managed to maintain a fragile peace and a degree of autonomy. This was a classic Roman strategy. Co-opt local leaders, use them to control the population, and avoid the cost and bloodshed of full-scale military conquest. But Venutius, her husband, was a hard-line anti-Roman. He was a proud warrior who saw Cartimandua's alliance as a betrayal of their people and their traditions. This created a dramatic and dangerous power struggle at the very top of the Brigantian leadership. The story of Cartimandua and Venutius is a true historical drama, full of betrayal and intrigue. Historians still argue whether their initial conflict was primarily political or personal, a mix of both, most likely. The queen eventually took up with her husband's armor-bearer, Vellocatus, and divorced Venutius. This was the final straw. It didn't just break up their marriage, it shattered the political stability of the Brigantes. The Confederation was plunged into civil war. Venutius rallied the anti-Roman factions, while Cartimandua, backed by Roman military support, fought to hold onto her throne. It was a classic he said she said situation, but with swords and shields and a whole lot of drama. The Roman military, always eager for a pretext to intervene, used the chaos to their advantage. They sent legions to support their client queen, effectively turning a local power struggle into a proxy war. This allowed Rome to slowly but surely tighten its grip on the northern parts of the island, all while claiming they were merely helping a friendly ally. It was a brilliant, if Machiavellian, political move. Eventually, the power struggle tipped in Venutius's favor, and Cartimandua was forced to flee, seeking final refuge with the Romans. The once mighty Brigantes confederation was shattered, leaving them vulnerable to the full force of Roman conquest. This long and drawn-out conflict shows that the British tribes were not a single, cohesive entity. They were a collection of powerful, proud, and often bickering groups, and their internal divisions were their greatest weakness against a disciplined and organized enemy like Rome. The Brigantes' story is a perfect example of how the personal and the political can intertwine with devastating consequences, forever changing the course of a people. Their downfall was not a sudden military defeat, but a slow, self-inflicted wound. While the Brigantes were caught up in their own internal conflicts, a different story of defiance and rebellion was brewing much further south on the flatlands of what is now East Anglia. This was the territory of the Iceni, a tribe known for their fierce independence and their skill with horses. Unlike the Brigantes, they initially tried to coexist with the Roman Empire, entering into a similar client kingdom arrangement. Their king, Prasutagus, a man of considerable wealth and influence, was a willing collaborator, a move he likely saw as the best way to preserve his people's way of life in the face of an unstoppable force. The Iceni were a proud people, and they had a deep respect for their traditions and a fierce loyalty to their leaders. But even with a seemingly amicable relationship, the tension between the native way of life and the encroaching Roman administration was a constant, simmering presence. Prasutagus was a pragmatist, but he had a problem. He had no male heir. In an attempt to safeguard his family and his tribe's future, he made a clever, if ultimately tragic, decision. He named the Roman emperor as co-heir in his will, alongside his own daughters. He believed this would appease Rome and guarantee the survival of his kingdom and his family's wealth. He thought he was playing by the rules, a polite and diplomatic way to transition power. It was a classic case of wishful thinking. The Romans, however, saw things very differently. To them, a client kingdom was just a stepping stone to full provincial status. When Prasutagus died, they ignored his will entirely. They saw no need for a co-heir when they could have it all. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a deliberate act of contempt. The Roman procurator, Catus Decianus, was sent to seize the Iceni kingdom. What followed was a series of shocking, brutal acts that lit the fuse of one of the most famous rebellions in British history. The Iceni were disarmed and their lands were confiscated. But the true outrage, the event that would seal Rome's fate in this part of Britain, was the public flogging of Prasutagus's wife, Queen Boudica, and the brutal assault on their daughters. This wasn't just a political act, it was a profound personal and cultural humiliation. In Celtic society, a woman's honor was deeply tied to the honor of her family and her tribe. To violate the queen in such a manner was an insult of the highest order, an act of unforgivable cruelty that no proud people could endure. Boudica, whose name likely meant victory, was not just a queen. She was a leader of immense charisma and power. She was described by the Roman historian Cassius Dio as a physically imposing woman with a harsh voice and a fierce countenance, with a great mass of red hair that cascaded down her back. Her presence alone was said to be enough to rally her people. Humiliated and enraged, she did not retreat. She rose up. She called on the other tribes who had been similarly oppressed by Roman rule, and they answered her call. The Trinovantes, whose capital at Camulodunum, modern Colchester, had been transformed into a Roman colony for retired soldiers, were eager to join. Their lands had been taken and their sacred places desecrated. They had their own deep grievances, and Boudica's call for vengeance was music to their ears. This wasn't just a spontaneous uprising, it was a carefully orchestrated rebellion. The rebels waited for a time when the main Roman army, under Governor Suetonius Paulinus, was far away campaigning in Wales. They knew the moment was right. The stage was set for a bloody and brutal conflict. Boudica's rebellion would go down in history as a fierce, if ultimately short-lived burst of resistance, a powerful reminder that even the most organized and powerful empire could be brought to its knees by the fury of a people pushed too far. It was an explosion of pent-up anger and a desperate final attempt to reclaim their freedom. And at its heart was a queen who had lost everything, but who found a new, terrible purpose in revenge. Her story is a testament to the power of a single individual to ignite a movement and to the deep-seated grievances that simmered beneath the surface of Roman-controlled Britain. The thunder of her war chariot was about to be heard across the land, beyond the political machinations and open warfare of the tribal kingdoms. There existed a deeper, more spiritual power that held the fabric of Celtic society together. This power was wielded by the Druids. They were not just a religious class, they were the intellectual heart of the Celtic world. Their role was all-encompassing, serving as priests, teachers, judges, doctors, and advisors to kings and chieftains. The name Druid itself is thought to come from a Celtic word meaning oak knower, which speaks to their reverence for nature and their deep knowledge of the sacred forests. They were a secret society, and all of their vast knowledge was passed down orally, from one generation to the next, through a rigorous and extensive training that could last up to 20 years. This emphasis on oral tradition meant they held a monopoly on knowledge, making them a profoundly powerful and mysterious force. The Romans were both fascinated and terrified by the Druids. They saw them as a dangerous source of resistance, a unifying force that could rally the tribes against them. The Druids' power was not tied to any one king or tribe. It transcended political boundaries, allowing them to communicate and organize across the whole island. This was a direct threat to Roman authority, which relied on the subjugation of individual tribes. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder wrote of the Druids' practice of gathering mistletoe from sacred oaks with a golden sickle, a ritual that highlighted their connection to the natural world and their unique spiritual authority. Their ceremonies often took place in sacred groves, far from the prying eyes of the populace. These places were considered the home of the gods, and the rituals performed there were a vital part of maintaining the cosmic order. One of the most famous and chilling accounts of a Druidic ritual comes from the Roman writer Tacitus, who described a scene on the island of Mona, modern Anglesey. When the Roman legions invaded, they found a grove filled with the altars of human sacrifice, a terrifying display of a practice that the Romans found barbaric. While historians still argue whether the Roman accounts of Druidic human sacrifice were an exaggeration intended to justify their own conquest, or a factual, if sensationalized representation of Celtic religious practices, there is archaeological evidence to support some of these claims, such as the discoveries of bog bodies like Lindo Man, who appears to have been a ritualistic sacrifice. These acts, whether rare or common, show a belief system that was profoundly different from the Roman one, with its emphasis on public temples and elaborate state-sponsored ceremonies. The Druids also served as the keepers of justice. They presided over disputes between tribes and individuals, and their judgments were final. They used their authority to enforce tribal laws and resolve conflicts, providing a level of social cohesion that was independent of any single chieftain. Their role as teachers meant they were the custodians of tribal history, myth, and philosophy. They taught the young nobles the art of war, the rules of society, and the stories of their ancestors. This made them essential for the continuity of the Celtic way of life. They were the glue that held the society together, and without them, the tribes would have likely been much more fragmented. But as the Romans expanded their control over Britain, they made it their mission to destroy the Druids. The final blow came in 60 AD when the Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus launched a full-scale invasion of Anglesey, which was considered the heart of Druidic power. The Romans slaughtered the Druids and their followers, cutting down their sacred groves and burning their altars. The systematic destruction of the Druidic class was a devastating blow to the native culture and a key step in Rome's conquest. It was a clear message. Roman law and Roman gods were to replace the old ways. The loss of the Druids meant the loss of a vast body of knowledge and a central pillar of resistance. While the memory of their power would linger, the Druids as a functioning class were gone, and the British tribes, now without their spiritual and intellectual leaders, were more vulnerable than ever. Long before the full-scale invasion of Britain, the island was already a place of curiosity, and to some, fear for the Roman world. The first Roman to set foot on its shores with military intent was none other than the legendary general and statesman Julius Caesar. His visits in 55 and 54 BC were not intended as a permanent conquest. They were more like reconnaissance missions. Fresh from his successful campaigns in Gaul, Caesar saw Britain as an extension of the Celtic world he had just spent years subduing. He was also likely motivated by a desire for prestige and the political necessity of showing Rome that his conquests were complete and final. He was a brilliant self-promoter, and a campaign across the sea to a land of myth and mystery would look very, very good on his resume. The first invasion in 55 BC was a relatively small affair. Caesar arrived with 2 legions, landing on the Kent coast. The Roman landing was a chaotic mess. The British chariots, a type of warfare completely foreign to the Romans, were a major problem. The British warriors used them to great effect, darting in and out, throwing javelins, and dismounting to fight on foot. It was a hit-and-run tactic that frustrated the disciplined Roman legions. The British tribes, though not united under a single king, were able to mount a surprisingly fierce resistance. They ambushed Roman foraging parties and harassed their legions, making it clear that this was not going to be an easy walk in the park. Caesar, facing a logistical nightmare, bad weather, and a determined enemy, decided to withdraw after a brief stay. He claimed victory, of course, because that's what Roman generals did, but in truth, it was more of a hasty retreat. He hadn't even made it far inland. The following year, in 54 BC, Caesar returned with a much larger force, 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry. This time, he was better prepared. He had ships specifically designed to withstand the tides of the channel and had learned from his previous mistakes. He landed unopposed and pushed further inland. He marched his army toward the territory of the Catuvellauni, the most powerful tribe in the southeast, under the leadership of their chieftain, Cassivellaunus. Cassivellaunus wisely chose not to meet the Romans in a pitched battle. Instead, he employed a scorched earth policy, retreating and burning crops to deny the Roman army supplies. He also used guerrilla warfare, with his warriors ambushing Roman patrols and supply lines. This was a classic strategy for a less equipped army against a superior force, and it worked surprisingly well. Caesar's campaign was a series of difficult marches and skirmishes, punctuated by a siege of Cassivellaunus's fortified settlement. But the Roman army, with its superior engineering and disciplined fighting style, eventually prevailed. Caesar's strategy of divide and conquer proved to be his most effective weapon. He exploited the existing rivalries between the various tribes. The Trinovantes, for example, were enemies of the Catuvellauni. Their exiled prince, Mandubracius, had fled to Caesar, who promised to restore him to power. This gave Caesar a local ally and a pretext to advance further. The Trinovantes willingly submitted to Roman authority and provided Caesar with crucial supplies and intelligence. Cassivellaunus, facing a Roman advance and the betrayal of his fellow tribes, eventually sued for peace. He promised to pay tribute to Rome and to leave Mandubracius's territory alone. Caesar, with the onset of winter approaching and still not having achieved a definitive conquest, was happy to accept. He took hostages and returned to Gaul, again claiming a great victory. While he did not establish a lasting presence, Caesar's invasions were a pivotal moment. They showed the British tribes that they were not invincible, and that a new, powerful enemy was interested in their land. For the Romans, Britain was no longer a mythical land at the edge of the world. It was a potential province, ripe for future conquest. The seeds of a much larger and much more permanent conflict had been sown. For nearly a century after Caesar's brief and ultimately inconclusive visits, Britain enjoyed a period of uneasy peace with Rome. But this peace was merely a delay. In AD 43, the time for a full-scale invasion finally came, orchestrated by the Emperor Claudius. He had recently ascended to the throne and was a bit of an underdog, eager to prove his worth and secure his legacy. A conquest of Britain, a land shrouded in myth and mystery, was just the ticket. Claudius's invasion was not a small-scale raid. It was a massive, carefully planned military operation involving 4 legions, totaling around 40,000 soldiers, plus an equal number of auxiliaries. It was an overwhelming force, a testament to Rome's ambition and power. The Roman army, led by the brilliant general Aulus Plautius, landed at a different location this time, likely near Richborough in Kent. The British tribes, expecting a repeat of Caesar's fleeting visits, were taken by surprise. They were still a collection of independent kingdoms, and their lack of a unified command was their greatest weakness against the organized might of Rome. They did, however, have a new leader. Togodumnus and his brother Caratacus, sons of the powerful Cativalonian king Cunobeline. The Cativaloni had become the dominant power in the southeast since Caesar's time, and they now bore the brunt of the Roman assault. Togodumnus led the initial resistance, but his forces were no match for the Roman legions. He was killed in one of the early battles, a significant blow to the British morale. The Roman advance was swift and methodical. They crossed the River Medway in a fierce battle and then moved on to the River Thames. The Romans, with their superior engineering, built a bridge to cross the river, bypassing a fortified British position. It was a classic example of Roman ingenuity and discipline overwhelming a less organized enemy. This strategic move allowed them to push into the heart of Cativalonian territory. Emperor Claudius himself, in a rather theatrical move, arrived with reinforcements, including war elephants, to participate in the capture of the Cativalonian capital, Camulodunum, modern Colchester. This wasn't a military necessity. It was a grand gesture, a political statement to solidify his claim to the conquest. He stayed for a mere 16 days, received the surrender of 11 British kings, and then returned to Rome to celebrate a magnificent triumph. It was a bit of a mic drop moment, Roman style, but the conquest was far from over. While the southeast had been subdued, the rest of the island remained unconquered and hostile. Caratacus, Togodumnus's brother, escaped and fled west, taking up the mantle of resistance. He would become the most persistent and formidable thorn in Rome's side for the next decade. The Roman invasion was a turning point. It marked the end of Britain's complete independence and the beginning of a long and often brutal period of Roman occupation. For the first time, the various British tribal kingdoms were no longer the masters of their own destiny. Their world was now intertwined with the vast and demanding machine of the Roman Empire. The Romans, ever pragmatic, began the long process of building their new province. They established a network of roads, built military forts, and began to extract the island's vast mineral wealth. But the subjugation was not easy. The British tribes were a proud people, and many, especially those in the more rugged parts of the island, refused to submit. The conquest would be a long, drawn-out affair, a grinding war of attrition that would last for decades. The victory that Claudius had celebrated in Rome was just the beginning of a long and difficult story, one that would see the British spirit of resistance tested time and time again. The Roman boots were on the ground, but the fire of rebellion was still burning brightly in the hearts of the native people. While Claudius was celebrating his triumph in Rome, the most determined leader of the British resistance was still very much at large. His name was Caratacus. As you remember, he was the son of the powerful Cativalonian king Cunobeline, and he had escaped the initial Roman advance. He was not a man to give up easily. He fled to the west, seeking refuge and allies among the tribes who were still unconquered. He found a new home among the Silures, a fierce and warlike tribe living in what is now South Wales. The Silures were known for their rugged independence and their skill in guerrilla warfare, perfectly suited to the mountainous terrain they called home. Caratacus became the new leader of their resistance, and for the next 8 years, he led a brilliant and frustrating campaign against the Roman invaders. He was a master of tactics, using the difficult landscape to his advantage. He avoided open field battles where the Roman legion's discipline and superior numbers would have been overwhelming. Instead, he used ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and a deep knowledge of the local terrain to harass the Roman army. He was a constant thorn in the side of a series of Roman governors who were sent to subdue him. The Roman high command saw his defiance as a personal insult, a challenge to the very idea of Roman invincibility. It must have been infuriating for them, constantly having their patrols disappear or their supply lines raided by a chieftain who refused to be caught. But all good things and all good rebellions must come to an end. In AD 51, Caratacus decided to change his strategy. He left the hills of Wales and led his forces into the territory of the Ordovices, a tribe in what is now central Wales. He chose a strong defensive position on a hill and prepared for a final, decisive battle against the Roman governor Publius Ostorius Scapula. It was a risky move, a departure from his successful guerrilla tactics. He had built up his army, convinced other tribes to join him, and he believed the time was right to face the Romans head-on. The Roman forces, however, were not to be underestimated. They were better disciplined, and their armor and weaponry were superior. The Romans, with their famous testudo formation, the shield wall, were a moving fortress, a sight that must have been both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The battle that followed was a classic clash of styles, the wild, furious charge of the Briton against the cold, methodical advance of the Roman legions. The Britons were brave, but they were no match for the Roman machine. They were soundly defeated. Caratacus himself managed to escape the battlefield, but his luck had run out. He fled north to the territory of the Brigantes, seeking refuge with their queen, Cartimandua. As you may recall from our third section, Cartimandua was a client queen, an ally of Rome. She saw this as an opportunity to curry favor with the powerful empire. She betrayed Caratacus, handing him over to the Romans in chains. Caratacus was taken to Rome as a prisoner of war, a prize of immense value. He was a legendary figure, the one man who had successfully resisted the Roman war machine for nearly a decade. But instead of being executed, as was customary for enemy leaders, he was given a chance to speak before the Emperor Claudius. His speech, as recorded by the Roman historian Tacitus, was a powerful plea for mercy. He argued that his resistance was not a sign of weakness, but a testament to his people's love of freedom. He famously said something along the lines of, "If you want to rule the world, you should not be afraid to be generous." Claudius, impressed by his courage and his eloquent speech, spared his life. It was an unprecedented act of Roman magnanimity. Caratacus was allowed to live out his days in Rome, a comfortable but powerless captive. His capture marked a major turning point in the Roman conquest of Britain. The most persistent source of native resistance had been neutralized, and the Romans could now push forward with the pacification of the island. With the most powerful leaders of the British resistance either dead or captured, the Roman Empire was finally able to shift its focus from conquest to administration. This was the beginning of the long, slow, and often messy process known as the Romanization of Britain. It wasn't a sudden, top-down cultural conversion. Instead, it was a gradual assimilation, a blend of Roman and Celtic traditions that created a unique new society. The Romans didn't force their culture on the natives at sword point. Not exactly. They were much more subtle and, in the long run, much more effective. They introduced a different way of life, and in many ways it was more comfortable. The Britons were offered a chance to buy into the Roman way of life, and for many, it was an attractive proposition. The most visible sign of this transformation was the building of new towns and cities. Roman Britain was a land of forts, yes, but it was also a land of vibrant urban centers. Towns like Londinium, London, Camulodunum, Colchester, and Eboracum, York, sprang up, built with Roman precision and planning. They had straight, grid-like streets, public baths, forums, and temples. These were not just administrative centers. They were hubs of commerce, culture, and social life. The Roman government encouraged the local aristocracy to move into these towns and build villas, large country houses with all the Roman amenities, like hypocausts, central heating, basically. This was a genius move. By getting the local elite to adopt Roman customs and lifestyles, they created a class of native collaborators who had a vested interest in the stability of the Roman system. The Roman legal system and bureaucracy were introduced, bringing a level of order and predictability that the tribal systems, with their endless feuds and shifting alliances, could not match. The Romans also brought their language, Latin. While the common people likely continued to speak their native Celtic tongues, Latin became the language of government, commerce, and high society. This was a powerful tool of cultural assimilation. If you wanted to get ahead, if you wanted to be a part of the new ruling class, you had to speak Latin. It was a clear path to social mobility, and for many ambitious Britons, it was a path worth taking. The Roman world offered new opportunities for trade and wealth. The island's resources, from lead and tin to grain and slaves, were now part of a massive, interconnected economy. Roman roads, a marvel of engineering, crisscrossed the country, making travel and trade faster and more efficient than ever before. It was a new world, a world of prosperity and order, and it was hard for many to resist its allure. Of course, this process was not without its tensions. Many Britons resisted the change, clinging to their old customs and spiritual beliefs. The Druids, as we've discussed, were a major source of resistance and a target of Roman suppression. The introduction of Roman gods and Roman-style temples was a direct challenge to the native religion. The Romans were, for the most part, tolerant of local deities, as long as they didn't interfere with Roman authority, but they always made it clear who was in charge. The people of Roman Britain also paid a heavy price for this new civilization. The taxes were high, and the Roman authorities were often brutal in their collections. The natives were subject to the whims of corrupt officials and the often harsh demands of the military. It wasn't all baths and roads, you know. But the process continued, a slow, grinding cultural change that fundamentally altered the character of the island. By the end of the 1st century AD, much of southern Britain was Romanized. The towns were thriving, the villas were full, and the old tribal identities were beginning to fade, replaced by a new, hybrid Romano-British identity. The children of the generation that had fought against Caesar and Claudius were now citizens of the Roman Empire, speaking Latin, wearing togas, and living in houses with central heating. It was a profound transformation, a story of assimilation and resistance, and it shows just how adaptable and resilient people can be, even in the face of an overwhelming and relentless force. While the Romans were busy building their new province and the native elites were getting comfortable in their new villas, the embers of a rebellion were still smoldering. The story of the Iceni, you will recall, was left in a state of high tension. The Roman procurator Catus Decianus had seized their lands, humiliated their queen Boudica, and assaulted her daughters. It was a mistake of epic proportions. The Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, was far away, campaigning on the island of Anglesey, leaving the heartland of the new province vulnerable and poorly defended. The Iceni, enraged and humiliated, rose up. They were joined by their neighbors, the Trinovantes, and other disaffected tribes. Their fury was a fire that had been building for years, fed by the heavy taxes, the confiscation of their lands, and the brutal arrogance of their new masters. Boudica, now a figure of vengeance and retribution, led her forces with a terrifying single-mindedness. Her army, a great mass of warriors, was a force of pure, destructive rage. Their first target was Camalodunum, the former capital of the Trinovantes, which had been turned into a Roman colony for retired soldiers. The Romans had built a temple to the deified Emperor Claudius there, a monument to their own power that must have been a daily insult to the native population. The colonists, a mix of old soldiers and Roman civilians, had little in the way of military training or defenses. The British warriors swarmed the city, and the ensuing massacre was brutal and total. The Roman inhabitants were slaughtered, and the city was burned to the ground. The temple, a symbol of Roman authority, was a particular target of their fury. After the destruction of Camulodunum, Boudica's army, now swollen to an incredible size with new recruits, turned its attention to Londinium, the bustling commercial center of the province. Londinium was a young city, not a military fortress, and it was filled with merchants and traders from all over the empire. When news of the rebellion reached Governor Suetonius Paulinus, he rushed to Londinium, but he knew he did not have enough men to defend it. In a grim and pragmatic decision, he abandoned the city, leaving its inhabitants to their fate. The panic must have been absolute. The sight of the Roman governor and his army retreating would have been a clear signal of the coming doom. Boudica's army swept into Londinium and repeated the devastation of Camalodunum. The city was put to the torch, and its inhabitants were slaughtered without mercy. The same fate befell Verulamium, modern St. Albans, another major Roman town. The sheer scale of the destruction was unprecedented. Tacitus, the Roman historian, tells us that Boudica's forces killed over 70,000 Romans and pro-Roman Britons. While this number is likely an exaggeration, it gives a sense of the scope of the rebellion and the fear it instilled in the Roman administration. The rebels' anger was not just directed at the Roman soldiers. It was directed at anyone who had embraced the Roman way of life. The destruction was aimed not just at Roman forts, but at the very symbols of Roman civilization. Boudica's rebellion was a powerful, if desperate, rejection of Roman culture and control. But the rebellion's success was also its greatest weakness. The British forces were a disorganized rabble, fueled by rage, not military discipline. They were not a professional army. When Suetonius Paulinus finally returned with his legions, he chose a field with a narrow front, which would negate the British army's numerical superiority. The final battle, the location of which is still debated by historians, was a catastrophic defeat for the British. The disciplined Roman legions, with their superior armor, weapons, and tactics, mowed down the British forces. The Roman soldiers, enraged by the massacres, showed no mercy. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, and according to Roman accounts, Boudica either took poison or died of disease. The aftermath was even more terrible. Rome exacted a terrible vengeance on the tribes that had participated in the uprising, and the process of Romanization continued, this time with a much firmer and more brutal hand. The rebellion of Boudica was a fleeting moment of victory, a last gasp of native defiance, but it ultimately sealed the fate of the British tribes for centuries to come. The thunder of her war chariots faded into history, with the Boudican rebellion crushed and the Roman grip on the province reestablished. The focus of Roman military activity shifted north. The new governor, Gnaeus Julius Agricola, arrived in Britain in AD 77, and he was a man with a clear mission: to complete the conquest of the island. He was no ordinary governor. He was a brilliant and experienced military commander who had served in Britain before. He was also Tacitus's father-in-law, which is why we have such a detailed, if sometimes glorifying, account of his campaigns. Agricola's strategy was simple but effective. He would not just fight battles, he would build, fortify, and consolidate. His legions would advance to subdue the local tribes, and then immediately build a network of roads and forts, leaving a permanent Roman presence in their wake. It was a strategy of total and irreversible conquest. Agricola spent his first year campaigning in what is now Wales, finally subduing the fierce Ordovices and Silures, the tribes that had given Caratacus his base of resistance. With the west secured, he turned his attention to the north. His goal was to conquer the entirety of what is now Scotland, a land the Romans called Caledonia. He moved his army steadily north, pushing beyond the limits of previous Roman expansion. He was a master of logistics, ensuring his army was always well supplied, even in the unforgiving northern terrain. His campaigns were marked by a series of impressive victories against the various tribes of the north. He defeated the Brigantes, finally bringing their large but fractured confederation under Roman control. He also moved into what is now the Scottish lowlands, establishing forts and beginning the process of Romanization there. The climax of Agricola's campaign came in AD 83 at the Battle of Mons Gropius. The exact location is a matter of intense scholarly debate, but it was likely in the Scottish Highlands. Agricola faced a massive Caledonian army led by a chieftain named Caratacus. Tacitus's account of the battle is famous, especially for the speech he attributes to Caratacus. The Caledonian chieftain supposedly gave a stirring address to his troops, famously saying that the Romans make a desert and call it peace. It was a beautiful and defiant phrase, capturing the essence of the British resistance to Roman rule. The battle itself, however, was a foregone conclusion. The Roman army, with its superior discipline, armor, and tactics, completely outmatched the Caledonian warriors. The Roman auxiliaries, particularly the Batavian and Tungrian cohorts, were a key part of the Roman victory. They charged the front ranks, and the Caledonian army, without a disciplined line of battle, was routed. Agricola's victory at Mons Graupius was a military triumph, but it was not a political one. He had defeated the Caledonian army, but he had not conquered the people. The Caledonian tribes simply retreated into the vast, wild highlands, a terrain that was impossible for a large Roman army to control. The Roman occupation of the Scottish lowlands was tenuous at best, and the constant threat of raids from the unconquered north was a perpetual problem. Agricola was recalled to Rome by the Emperor Domitian, who may have been jealous of his success, and the frontier was pulled back from the highlands. The Roman forts in the north were abandoned, and a new, more permanent frontier was established. This period of expansion and then contraction shows the limits of Roman power. While they could defeat any army they faced in a pitched battle, they could not control a vast, untamable wilderness filled with a fiercely independent people who refused to submit. Agricola's campaigns were the high water mark of Roman expansion in Britain. The idea of conquering the whole island was abandoned, and the focus shifted to consolidation and defense. The land of the Caledonians would forever remain beyond the pale of the Roman Empire, a constant reminder that their power was not absolute. The story of the Caledonians, a people who would later be known as the Picts, had just begun. With the dream of a fully Romanized Britain fading, the empire's priorities shifted. The vast expense and constant military pressure of holding a deep frontier in the highlands were simply not sustainable. The new strategy was one of consolidation, not expansion. The solution to this was one of the most remarkable engineering feats of the ancient world: a permanent, physical barrier across the narrowest part of the island. This was the birth of Hadrian's Wall, a monument to both Roman power and Roman pragmatism. It was begun around AD 122 during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, a man known for his love of travel and his penchant for solidifying the borders of the Roman Empire rather than expanding them further. He believed that the Roman Empire had reached its natural limits, and his philosophy was to fortify and protect rather than to conquer and annex. The wall was a colossal project. It stretched for 80 Roman miles, from the banks of the River Tyne in the east to the Solway Firth in the west. It wasn't just a simple wall, it was a complex military zone. The main wall itself was initially built of stone in the east and turf in the west. Behind it, a military road ran the entire length, allowing for the rapid movement of troops and supplies. A ditch, known as the Vallum, was dug to the south of the wall, creating a further buffer zone. There were forts, known as castella, placed at strategic intervals, and mile castles, smaller fortifications, were built every Roman mile, with 2 observation turrets in between each one. It was a masterpiece of planning and execution, a true testament to the organizational power of Rome. Historians still argue whether the primary purpose of Hadrian's Wall was military or symbolic. It's likely it was a bit of both. On one hand, it was an effective military barrier, designed to control the movement of people and to prevent large-scale raids from the north. It wasn't intended to be impregnable, but rather to deter and channel traffic, making it easier for the Roman army to respond to threats. It allowed the Romans to maintain a much smaller force in the north, freeing up legions for other duties across the empire. On the other hand, it was a profound psychological statement. It was a clear, undeniable line drawn in the ground. It said, "This is where the Roman world ends. Everything on this side is ours, and everything on that side is not." It was a visible manifestation of Roman imperial authority, a clear message to both the native tribes and the empire's own citizens that the frontier was secure. The construction of the wall was a Herculean effort. It required thousands of soldiers, as well as native British laborers, working for years in all kinds of weather. The soldiers were not just builders, they were also the garrison. They lived in the forts along the wall, standing guard and maintaining the immense structure. The work was slow, grueling, and dangerous, but it was completed with the same discipline and efficiency that characterized all Roman military projects. The material used for the wall also tells a story. In the east, the wall was made of stone, a durable and permanent material, while in the west, it was made of turf. This wasn't a sign of laziness. It was a matter of logistics. The local geology and availability of stone dictated the choice of material. The wall stood as the northernmost limit of the Roman Empire for nearly 300 years. It became a living, breathing part of the landscape. Its shadow, both literal and metaphorical, fell across the lives of everyone in northern Britain. It represented a fundamental divide, not just between two lands, but between two ways of life. It was a physical and psychological border that separated the Romanized South from the unconquered wild North. The story of the wall is not just the story of a stone barrier, but the story of the people who built it, the people who defended it, and the people who lived in its long shadow. It was a silent witness to centuries of uneasy peace and constant tension, a symbol of a frontier that could never truly be tamed. Living along the wall was a unique and often challenging experience. For the Roman soldiers, the wall was not just a military posting, it was home. The forts that dotted the length of Hadrian's wall were bustling cosmopolitan communities. Soldiers from all corners of the Roman Empire were stationed here, Batavians from what is now the Netherlands, Tungrians from Belgium, and even Sarmatians from the steppes of Eastern Europe. This made the garrisons a true melting pot of cultures, languages, and religions. The air would have been a chaotic mix of Latin commands, Celtic gossip, and foreign dialects. These soldiers lived in barracks, trained relentlessly, and stood guard on the turrets. They were a disciplined and professional force, but they were also just regular guys, trying to make a life for themselves in a cold and rainy land far from home. The forts were more than just military outposts. They were mini towns in their own right, with bathhouses, administrative buildings, and small shrines. Outside the fort walls, a civilian settlement known as a vicus would often spring up. These settlements were a mix of merchants, craftsmen, and the families of the soldiers. It was a symbiotic relationship. The civilians provided goods and services, and the soldiers provided protection and a steady flow of income. This close proximity led to a fascinating blend of cultures. The native Britons who lived nearby were drawn to the Roman forts by the promise of trade and work. They sold their goods, worked on Roman building projects, and served as guides and interpreters. It was a new world for them, full of strange and wondrous things. This cultural exchange was not always peaceful. Tensions were always simmering beneath the surface. The Romans were the conquerors, and they often acted with a degree of arrogance and condescension. But over time, a degree of coexistence and even integration developed. Roman soldiers often married native British women, and their children grew up with a foot in both worlds, speaking both Latin and their native Celtic tongue. The Roman authorities were pragmatic about this. They knew that a happy garrison and a cooperative native population were essential for the stability of the frontier. They tolerated the local gods and rituals, and even incorporated some of them into their own pantheon. The Romano-British identity, which we've mentioned before, was truly forged in places like this. Life on the wall was not for the faint of heart. The weather was often brutal, the winters long and dark. The constant threats of raids from the Caledonian tribes to the north was a perpetual source of anxiety. But there was also a sense of purpose and camaraderie. The soldiers, far from their homes and families, forged close bonds with their comrades in arms. They were a family, a brotherhood, a little island of Roman civilization in a sea of untamed wilderness. The archaeological evidence tells a fascinating story of their daily lives. We have found everything from beautifully carved religious artifacts to simple wooden writing tablets with shopping lists and letters to home. One particularly famous collection of these tablets, found at Vindolanda Fort, gives us a glimpse into the mundane realities of life on the frontier, with complaints about the quality of the beer and requests for more socks. The wall was, in a sense, a world of its own. It was a place where two distinct cultures met, clashed, and eventually blended. It was a frontier, a barrier, but it was also a bridge. The people who lived in its shadow, both Roman and native, created a new kind of society, one that was both a product of the empire and a rejection of it. The wall was a constant solid presence in their lives, a silent witness to a time of profound change. Its stones, still standing today, are not just a record of Roman power, but a testament to the resilience and adaptability of the people who lived and died in its long shadow. The Caledonians to the north, however, had a very different story to tell. They lived beyond the wall in a land that was their own, a land that would never be truly conquered. Beyond the stone and turf of Hadrian's wall lay a land that the Romans could never fully subdue. This was Caledonia, the name they gave to what is now Scotland, a rugged, wild place of mountains, lochs, and a people who refused to be conquered. The most famous of these tribes were the Caledoni, and later the Maiati. They were not a single nation, but a loose collection of warrior tribes, united only by their shared independence and their fierce hatred for the Roman invaders. Their way of life was nomadic and tribal, centered around their chieftains and their deep spiritual connection to the land. Unlike the Romanized South, with its towns and roads, the Caledonian world was a landscape of small settlements, Hillforts, and vast, untamed wilderness. The Caledonian tribes were masters of guerrilla warfare. They knew every valley, every pass, every hidden path in the highlands. A large Roman army, with its cumbersome baggage train, was like a bull in a china shop in this terrain. The Caledonians would melt into the mist-shrouded hills, only to reappear and ambush Roman patrols and supply lines. This was a war of attrition, a constant low-level conflict that drained Roman resources and morale. The Roman historians, like Tacitus, often wrote about the Caledonians with a mix of fear and grudging admiration. They were a formidable foe, a people who, in the words of their own chieftain Caratacus, were the last free people on earth. This was a powerful idea, and it must have resonated deeply with the Roman soldiers who were a long, long way from home. The Picts, whose name means painted ones, would later emerge from these northern tribes. They were a mysterious people, known for their elaborate tattoos and their unique, enigmatic symbols carved on stones across the north of Britain. These symbols, a beautiful mix of animals, abstract patterns, and objects, are a constant source of fascination for archaeologists and historians. They are a kind of silent language, a record of a people who did not write their history down in a way we can easily understand. They were a confederation of tribes, and their power grew as the Roman Empire in Britain began to wane. They were a constant threat to the frontier, a persistent source of raids and skirmishes that kept the Roman garrisons on high alert. The Roman response to this constant threat was a mix of military action and diplomacy. They would launch punitive expeditions into Caledonia, but these campaigns were always temporary. The Romans would burn villages and kill warriors, but they could never truly catch or subdue the entire population. It was like trying to catch the wind. They also tried to bribe the Caledonian chieftains, offering them gifts and money to keep the peace. But these deals were often short-lived. The Caledonians were a proud people, and they saw the Roman gifts as a sign of weakness, not strength. Their raids continued unabated, a steady, persistent pressure on the Roman frontier. The wall, while a symbol of Roman power, was also a symbol of their failure to conquer the entire island. It was a clear admission that there were limits to their imperial ambition. The existence of a free, unconquered people just beyond their border must have been a constant source of frustration for the Roman governors. The Caledonians, with their courage and their knowledge of their land, were the ultimate anti-Rome. They represented a way of life that was the antithesis of Roman civilization. They were wild and free, and they refused to be tamed. The story of the Caledonians and the Picts is a powerful reminder that history is not just a story of conquest, but a story of resistance. It is the story of a people who, against all odds, held on to their freedom, and whose legacy, in the form of their art and their spirit, still echoes in the hills and glens of Scotland today. The Roman Empire was a massive, powerful machine, but even the greatest of machines eventually begin to show signs of wear and tear. By the late 3rd and early 4th centuries AD, the long, slow process of Roman decline had begun to cast a shadow over the province of Britain. The reasons for this decline were complex and multifaceted, a mix of internal strife and external pressure. Internally, the empire was struggling with political instability. Emperors came and went with alarming frequency, often elevated by a legionary revolt, and then just as quickly assassinated by a rival faction. This crisis of the 3rd century meant that a consistent, long-term policy for Britain was almost impossible to maintain. Governors and military commanders were often more concerned with securing their own power base and political ambitions than with the stability of the province itself. This constant power struggle weakened the central authority and left the frontier garrisons feeling increasingly isolated and neglected. The Roman military machine, once a model of discipline and efficiency, was also showing signs of strain. Pay was often irregular, and the quality of new recruits was declining. The legions, who had once been the ultimate symbol of Roman power, were becoming more like private armies loyal to their generals. This made them less effective at dealing with the growing number of external threats. The external pressures were mounting from all sides. The Roman world was no longer just dealing with one or two powerful enemies. It was facing a whole host of new threats. In Britain, the unconquered tribes to the north, like the Picts, were becoming more organized and more aggressive. They were no longer just a nuisance. They were a serious strategic threat. Their raids were becoming larger and more frequent, pushing deep into Roman territory. The Irish, known to the Romans as the Scotti, were also beginning to raid the western coasts of Britain. They were skilled seafarers and brutal raiders, and the Roman defenses on the west coast were unprepared for this new threat. They would sweep in, sack a coastal town or villa, and disappear back into the mists of the Irish Sea before a Roman patrol could even arrive. And finally, the Germanic peoples from the European mainland, like the Saxons, were beginning to raid the eastern and southern coasts. The term Saxon shore was coined to describe the chain of Roman forts built to defend against these new invaders. The response from Rome was often slow and inadequate. The central government was too preoccupied with problems closer to home. The Sasanian Empire in the east, the Franks and Goths in Gaul, and the endless succession crises. Britain was a far-flung province, and it was becoming less of a priority. The Roman authorities tried to deal with the problem by building more forts and shoring up the defenses, but it was like trying to plug a leaky dam with a single finger. The invasions were coming from too many directions, and the resources were simply not there to deal with them all. The local Romano-British population, which had once been so eager to embrace the Roman way of life, was becoming increasingly disillusioned. The promise of peace and order was being replaced by a reality of instability and fear. This slow decline marked a fundamental shift in the relationship between Britain and the Empire. Britain was no longer a profitable and peaceful province. It was a drain on resources, a source of constant headaches for the Roman government. The great days of expansion and consolidation were long gone. The focus had shifted from building to merely surviving. The great Roman roads, once a symbol of unity, now served as easy routes for invaders to penetrate the heartland. The towns and villas, once a sign of prosperity, were becoming vulnerable targets. The final act of this long, drawn-out decline was still a long way off, but the writing was on the wall. The great engine of the Roman Empire was beginning to sputter and slow, and the consequences for the people of Britain would be profound. The mounting pressures on Roman Britain came to a head in a moment of coordinated chaos that historians now refer to as the Great Barbarian Conspiracy of 367 AD. This was not a single, decisive battle, but rather a perfect storm of simultaneous attacks from all sides. It was a clear signal that the great Roman frontier, which had stood for centuries, was now dangerously exposed. From the north, the Picts, long a persistent but manageable threat, launched a massive invasion, pushing past Hadrian's wall and flooding into the heart of the province. Their swift and devastating raids were no longer just about plunder. They were about conquest. The Picts, with their newfound audacity, were a new kind of threat. At the same time, the Scotti from Ireland, a people who had previously been content with hit-and-run raids on the western coast, launched a full-scale assault. Their longboats landed on the shores of Wales and western Britain, and they pushed inland, meeting little to no organized resistance. They were a terrifying force, known for their ferocity and their ability to strike without warning. To make matters worse, the Saxons, who had been raiding the eastern and southern shores for decades, now came in greater numbers. They landed with their armies, bypassing the coastal forts that were supposed to defend against them, and spread across the countryside. The Roman military command in Britain was completely overwhelmed. The different invasions were not planned in a single meeting room. The tribes didn't have phones, but the timing of the attacks suggests a sort of unspoken agreement, or at least a shared recognition of Roman weakness. The Roman military, already stretched thin and poorly led, was in a state of disarray. The commander of the Roman army in Britain, a man named Hillforts, was ambushed and either killed or captured, leaving the legions leaderless. The Roman civilian administration was in a state of panic, and the Romano-British population, who had come to rely on the Roman army for protection, was left to fend for itself. The forts along Hadrian's wall, once so formidable, were overrun or simply abandoned. The great frontier had been breached, and the heart of the province was now under attack. It was a complete and total breakdown of the Roman system. This was the moment that the old tribal kingdoms, or their descendants, found their opportunity. The Roman Empire was forced to act. The Emperor Valentinian sent a brilliant general, Flavius Theodosius, the father of the future Emperor Theodosius the Great, to restore order. Theodosius arrived in Britain in 368 AD and launched a series of swift and decisive campaigns. He drove back the Picts, defeated the Scotti, and cleared the Saxon invaders from the coasts. He restored the defenses of the wall, and for a brief time, it seemed as if the old order had been restored. He was a brilliant commander, a true hero of the Roman Empire, and his actions showed that Rome still had the power to protect its provinces. But Theodosius's victory was only a temporary reprieve. The underlying problems remained. The empire was still struggling with internal strife, and the external pressures were only going to get worse. The brief restoration of order in Britain was followed by more military revolts and a gradual but irreversible withdrawal of Roman power. The Great Barbarian Conspiracy was not the end of Roman Britain, but it was the beginning of the end. It exposed the deep vulnerabilities of the province and showed the people that the old days of absolute Roman authority were over. The memory of this terrible time would linger, and it would leave the province permanently scarred and on the path to a future that was no longer Roman. After the brief respite brought by Theodosius, the decline of Roman power in Britain accelerated. The final act was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, agonizing process. The Roman Empire was being squeezed from all sides, and Britain, a distant and expensive province, was one of the first to be let go. The central government was facing a series of dire threats closer to home. The Germanic tribes were crossing the Rhine and Danube frontiers in massive numbers, and the capital, Rome, was itself under threat. The famous quote from the Roman writer Gaius Sallustius Crispus, "In unity there is strength," was lost as the empire fragmented. The empire could no longer afford to garrison every province, and so it had to make some difficult choices. The final withdrawal of Roman legions from Britain is one of those moments in history where the exact details are a little fuzzy. The traditional date given by many historians is 410 AD, when the Emperor Honorius sent a letter to the cities of Britain, effectively telling them to fend for themselves. This was not a formal decree of independence. It was more of an admission that Rome could no longer provide military support. The legions, what was left of them, were recalled to defend Gaul and Italy. They left behind a country that had been a part of their empire for nearly 400 years. It must have been a strange, surreal moment for the Romano-British population. The soldiers, who had been a constant presence for so long, were simply gone. The departure of the legions left a power vacuum. The Roman administrative and military infrastructure that had provided a framework for life was no longer there. The Roman roads, once a symbol of order, were now just dusty tracks with no one to guard them. The public services, like the baths and forums, fell into disrepair. The intricate network of trade and commerce that had connected Britain to the wider Roman world began to unravel. The coin economy collapsed, and people reverted to a barter system. The great villas of the Romano-British elite were abandoned as the countryside became too dangerous. Without the Roman army, the local population was left defenseless against the Picts, Scotti, and Saxons, who now saw an open invitation to raid and plunder. This period, from the departure of the Romans to the establishment of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, is known as the Dark Ages. The name is a bit of a misnomer, as it wasn't a time of complete ignorance. It's simply a period for which we have very little written documentation. The vibrant, literate culture of Roman Britain was replaced by a quieter, more fragmented society. The British people, a mix of Celtic natives and Romano-British hybrids, were forced to rely on their own leaders for protection. The old tribal kingdoms, which had been dormant for centuries, began to re-emerge, but they were no longer the simple societies they had once been. They were now a mix of Roman and Celtic traditions, a people caught between two worlds. The most profound consequence of the Roman withdrawal was the loss of a unified military command. There was no single army to defend the island. Instead, local warlords and chieftains rose to power, each with their own small force, each vying for control. The people had no choice but to rely on these local strongmen for protection. This instability created the perfect conditions for the next great wave of invaders. The Anglo-Saxons, who had been raiding for decades, now began to settle. They came not just as raiders, but as colonists, bringing their families, their language, and their own gods. The chapter of Roman Britain had closed, and a new, more uncertain one was about to begin. The final echo of the legion's footsteps faded into the distant horizon. With the Roman legions gone, the Romano-British population, long dependent on the empire for protection, found themselves in a perilous situation. The raids from the Picts and Scotti were relentless, and there was no central army to stop them. In a desperate move, some British leaders, including a figure known as Vortigern, made a fateful decision. They invited a new group of people to help them fight off their enemies. These new people came from the northern parts of modern-day Germany and Denmark, and they were known as the Anglo-Saxons. The first to arrive were the Jutes, followed by the Angles and the Saxons. They were not a unified nation, but a collection of tribes, and their initial arrival was at the invitation of the British, who hoped they would serve as mercenaries, a strong new shield against the raiders from the north and west. The Anglo-Saxons were fierce warriors and skilled seafarers. They had a different culture and a different way of life from the Romano-British. They worshipped their own gods, a pantheon that included Woden, Thunor, and Tiw, figures we still see echoed in our days of the week. Their society was based on kinship groups and loyalty to a chieftain, a signing or king, a role which was more about leading warriors than ruling a kingdom. Their arrival was a gradual process. They didn't come as a single conquering army. Instead, small groups of them settled in the eastern and southern parts of the island, in the areas that we now call East Anglia and Kent. They were initially welcomed, but as their numbers grew, so did their ambitions. The story of the Anglo-Saxon arrival is a fascinating and often debated one. The traditional view, based largely on the accounts of Gildas and Bede, is that the British made a terrible mistake. They hired mercenaries who, once they had done their job, turned on their employers. The Anglo-Saxons, realizing the weakness of the Romano-British, decided to take the land for themselves. This led to a long and brutal conflict, but historians now believe that the story is more complex. The Anglo-Saxons likely came in waves, some as invited guests, others as raiders, and still others as peaceful settlers seeking new land to farm. The archaeological evidence suggests that there was a period of coexistence and cultural exchange before the violence became widespread. This was not a sudden conquest, but a slow, grinding process of displacement and change. The Anglo-Saxons brought their own language, a Germanic tongue that would eventually evolve into modern English. The native Celtic languages, once spoken all over Britain, were pushed to the margins, to the west and north. The cultural landscape of Britain was changing dramatically. The old Roman towns, with their stone buildings and complex infrastructure, were often abandoned. The Anglo-Saxons preferred to live in small, scattered rural settlements, building their villages from wood and thatch, a far cry from the urban life of the Roman period. The old Roman roads, once so vital, fell into disuse. The arrival of the Anglo-Saxons marked the end of the Romano-British period and the beginning of a new era for the island. The old tribal kingdoms and their Romano-British successors were now fighting for their survival against a powerful and persistent new enemy. The native British, pushed to the western fringes of the island, would eventually come to be known as the Welsh, their name derived from an Old English word for foreigner. The island was no longer Britain, it was becoming England, the land of the Angles. The stage was set for a long and often brutal struggle for control of the island, a conflict that would last for centuries and would define the future of the British Isles. As the Anglo-Saxons pushed westward, the displaced Romano-British people held on, clinging to their culture and their heritage in the shrinking territories of Wales and the western parts of Britain. This was a time of great upheaval and conflict, a time when the very idea of a unified Britain was under threat. It was in this chaotic period that a legend was born, a legend that has captured the imagination for centuries, the story of King Arthur. The name Arthur appears in the earliest sources as a leader who fought a series of 12 battles against the invading Anglo-Saxons, culminating in a great victory at the Battle of Badon. This figure, whether real or a composite of several leaders, became a symbol of British resistance and hope. He was a champion of the old ways, a hero who fought to preserve the Christian and Romanized culture of the British people against the pagan Anglo-Saxon invaders. The problem for historians is that there is no definitive contemporary evidence of a King Arthur. The earliest mentions of him come from the 9th century work Historia Brittonum, written by the Welsh monk Nennius. He lists Arthur's battles but provides few details. The much later Welsh and Latin texts, like the Annales Cambriae, also mention Arthur, but they too are sparse on details. Historians still argue whether Arthur was a real person, a legendary figure, or a military commander who led the British resistance. There is no doubt that a leader of some sort was needed to stem the Anglo-Saxon tide, and perhaps that leader was Arthur. The story of Arthur is, in a way, a historical fact, because it shows us that the British people desperately needed a hero to believe in. The Arthurian legend is not just a story of a single man. It's a reflection of the profound cultural and political shifts of the time. The story of Arthur and his knights, of Camelot and the Round Table, is a later embellishment, a beautiful but often misleading layer of medieval romance added to the core legend. The original Arthur was not a knight in shining armor with a courtly love for Guinevere. He was a fierce warrior, a commander who fought on horseback with a mix of Roman and Celtic tactics. He was a champion of a dying culture, a defender of a land that was being slowly but surely taken from its people. His story, with its themes of betrayal and a last stand against an overwhelming enemy, resonated with the people who were fighting a losing battle. The legacy of Arthur is not in his historical reality, but in his power as a symbol. He represented the resilience of the British people. His legend gave them hope during a time when all hope seemed lost. The idea of a once and future king, a leader who would one day return to save his people, became a central part of Welsh folklore and a powerful symbol of national identity. While the Anglo-Saxons were busy building their new kingdoms, the British were keeping the flame of their past alive through stories of their legendary hero. The story of Arthur is a reminder that history is not just a collection of facts, it is also a collection of myths and legends, stories that a people tell themselves to make sense of a difficult world. The real story of King Arthur may be lost to us forever, but his legacy, in the form of a beautiful and enduring legend, lives on. He is the ghost of a lost kingdom, a hero who will always be remembered. While the Romano-British clung to their past and their legendary heroes, the Anglo-Saxons were busy building a new future. Their settlement was not just a military conquest, it was a process of colonization. As their numbers grew, they began to carve out territories for themselves, and these territories would eventually evolve into kingdoms. This was the birth of the Heptarchy, the term used to describe the 7 main Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that dominated England for centuries. The names of these kingdoms, Wessex, Essex, Sussex, Kent, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria, are still familiar to us today. They are a physical reminder of the Anglo-Saxon legacy. This was a time of immense change, a new political landscape being drawn with blood and iron. The process was slow and brutal. The native British people were either killed, enslaved, or pushed west into the rugged hills of Wales and Cornwall. In the Anglo-Saxon historical accounts, this period is often portrayed as a righteous conquest, a victory for the true English people. But from the British perspective, it was a catastrophe, a time of loss and displacement. The old way of life was being replaced by a new one, a Germanic society with a different language, different gods, and different customs. The archaeological evidence tells a grim story, showing a sharp decline in population and the widespread destruction of Romano-British settlements. The once thriving towns of Roman Britain were left to crumble, and new villages, built from wood and thatch, rose up around them. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were not a single unified entity. They were fiercely independent and constantly at war with one another. The history of the Heptarchy is a history of shifting alliances, betrayals, and endless conflicts. One king would rise to prominence, a Britwalda or Briton ruler, only to be overthrown by a rival. For a time, Northumbria, a kingdom in the north, was the dominant power. Then Mercia, in the middle of England, took its turn. Then finally, Wessex, in the south, would rise to become the most powerful. This constant competition for supremacy was a defining feature of the era. The Anglo-Saxons, much like the Celtic tribes before them, were a collection of bickering kingdoms, and this internal division was a source of both weakness and strength. The Anglo-Saxon kings were not like the Roman emperors. Their power was not absolute. They were war leaders, and their authority depended on their ability to lead their warriors to victory and to provide them with land and plunder. The Anglo-Saxon society was a warrior society, and a king's worth was measured by his martial prowess. They were the champions of their people, and their loyalty was to their clan and their kin. The Anglo-Saxon religion, a pagan belief system, was a reflection of this warrior culture. It was a world of gods and heroes, of fate and courage, a world where a man's honor was his most prized possession. The legacy of the Anglo-Saxons is all around us. Their language, their laws, and their social structures lay the foundation for modern England. The very name of the country is a testament to their victory, but their rise was a tragedy for the native British people who saw their world disappear, replaced by a new culture and a new set of rulers. The story of the Anglo-Saxons is a story of a new people in a new land building a new civilization on the ashes of the old. It was a time of great change, of violence and conquest, but also a time of birth and renewal. The old British tribal kingdoms were a fading memory, and the new Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were the future. As the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms spread across the eastern and central parts of the island, the native British people were not simply annihilated. They were pushed to the geographical fringes, into the more mountainous and rugged terrain of the West. It was here, in the land we now call Wales, that the native British culture not only survived, but also flourished, forming a new set of distinct kingdoms. They were a people who had been pushed to their physical and spiritual limits, and their new home became a fortress of their old ways. They still spoke their Celtic language, a tongue that had been spoken in Britain for thousands of years, and they held on to their traditions and their Christian faith, which had been introduced during the Roman era. This period saw the rise of legendary Welsh kingdoms, such as Gwynedd in the northwest, Powys in the middle, and Dyfed in the southwest. These were not large, centralized kingdoms like those of the Anglo-Saxons. They were often smaller, more localized polities, ruled by powerful warlords who were constantly vying for power and fighting to defend their borders against both the Anglo-Saxons to the east and the Irish to the west. Their history is a complex tapestry of shifting alliances, internal conflicts, and a continuous struggle for survival. The Welsh, as they were now called by the Anglo-Saxons, were fiercely independent and proud, and their poets and bards were the keepers of their history and their identity. The mountainous landscape of Wales was their greatest ally. It made it difficult for the Anglo-Saxon armies to penetrate deep into their territory, and it allowed the British to use guerrilla warfare to great effect. They would retreat into the hills and then strike when their enemies were most vulnerable, but the Welsh kingdoms were not immune to the pressures of the Anglo-Saxon expansion. Over the centuries, their eastern border, the one with the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia, was a line of constant conflict. This struggle would eventually lead to the construction of Offa's Dyke, a massive earthwork that served as a border between Mercia and Wales. It was a clear, undeniable line drawn in the ground, a physical manifestation of the great cultural and political divide that now existed on the island. The Welsh kingdoms also had to contend with the growing power of the Irish kingdoms. The Irish, known as the Scoti, had established a presence in what is now Argyll and the Western Isles of Scotland, creating the kingdom of Dal Riata, and they were also raiding and settling in parts of Wales. This forced the Welsh to fight on two fronts, making their struggle for survival even more precarious. But despite all these challenges, they held on. The Welsh language and culture, which had seemed doomed to extinction, survived. The poets of Wales, like Taliesin and Aneurin, composed their verses in a language that was a direct descendant of the one spoken by the warriors who had fought against the Romans. The story of the Welsh kingdoms is a powerful testament to the resilience of a people. They were a people who had lost their country, but they had not lost their spirit. They had been pushed to the edge, but they had not given up. They had been forced to adapt, to fight, and to survive, and in doing so, they had created a new and vibrant culture. The Welsh kingdoms were the last great stronghold of the ancient British tribal kingdoms. They were a living link to a past that had been largely erased in the rest of England. Their story is a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, a people can hold on to their identity and their heritage. While the Anglo-Saxons pushed west and the Welsh solidified their new kingdoms, another set of unique and mysterious tribes held onto the northern parts of Britain beyond the Roman frontiers. These were the Picts. The name Picts was given to them by the Romans, likely meaning painted ones, a reference to their practice of tattooing or body painting. They were the people who had fought against the Romans for centuries, the ones who had a part in the great barbarian conspiracy. But they were much more than just a military threat. They were a people with a rich, unique culture that remains a source of fascination and mystery to this day. The Picts left no written records of their own, and so much of what we know about them comes from the accounts of their enemies and the silent language of their art. And what art it was! The Picts were incredible sculptors, and they left behind thousands of beautifully carved stone monuments, known as Pictish stones. These stones, which are found all over Scotland, are covered with enigmatic symbols, animals like serpents, salmon, and mythical beasts, as well as abstract patterns and symbols that we still cannot fully decipher. They are a kind of silent language, a record of a society that we can only glimpse through a glass darkly. Some historians believe they represent a system of writing, perhaps a tribal or familial identification, while others think they are a form of memorial or religious art. The Pictish society was not a single unified kingdom. It was a confederation of smaller tribes and kingdoms that would at times come together to fight a common enemy. The leadership was often fluid, and the succession of kings was not always from father to son. In fact, historians still argue whether the Picts practiced a system of matriarchal succession where the kingship passed through the female line. The existence of many high-status female burials and the occasional mention of powerful Pictish queens in contemporary records has led to this open scholarly debate. It is a fascinating question that speaks to the unique nature of their society. The Picts were a constant thorn in the side of their neighbors. They fought against the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria, which pushed north into their territory, and they also fought against the Irish kingdom of Dal Riata. Their history is one of endless conflict and shifting alliances. But they were also a people of incredible resilience and determination. They managed to survive for centuries, holding on to their territory and their identity in the face of constant pressure from the more powerful kingdoms around them. Their final great victory came in 685 AD at the Battle of Dun-Nechtine, where they decisively defeated the Northumbrian army, killing their king, Ecgfrith. This victory put a stop to Northumbrian expansion and secured the Pictish kingdom's independence for another 200 years. It was a stunning victory for a people who were so often underestimated. But the end of the Pictish story was not a military defeat. It was a gradual process of cultural assimilation. The Picts eventually merged with their neighbors, the Irish of Dal Riata, to form the new kingdom of Alba, which would eventually become Scotland. The reasons for this merger are still debated. Some historians believe it was a peaceful union, while others think it was a slow conquest by the Scotti. Regardless, The Pictish language and culture slowly faded away, replaced by the Gaelic language and culture of their new rulers. The mysterious Picts, with their painted bodies and their silent stones, sank into legend, leaving behind a beautiful and enigmatic legacy. Amidst the constant conflicts and cultural shifts, a powerful and unifying force was quietly re-entering the British Isles: Christianity. It was not a new faith to the island. It had taken root during the Roman period, but its influence had waned with the departure of the legions and the rise of the pagan Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The reintroduction of Christianity was a two-pronged process, coming from different directions and in different forms. First, from the West, the Celtic Church, which had survived in the isolated pockets of Wales and Ireland, began to spread its influence back into the British Isles. Irish monks, known for their rigorous asceticism and their love of learning, were at the forefront of this mission. The most famous of these missionaries was Saint Columba, who in the 6th century founded a monastery on the island of Iona, off the coast of Scotland. From this remote outpost, his followers traveled far and wide, converting the Picts and the Scots and re-establishing a Christian presence in the north. The Celtic form of Christianity was different from the one that would later come from Rome. It had a unique organizational structure centered around powerful abbots and monasteries, rather than bishops and dioceses. It had its own traditions, its own way of calculating the date of Easter, and its own style of tonsure. The monks were often more solitary, living as hermits in remote locations, and their devotion was intense. This form of Christianity took hold among the Welsh and the Picts, and for a time it seemed as if the island would be a patchwork of different Christian traditions. Then, from the south, a second and more powerful wave of Christian missionaries arrived, this time from Rome. In the late 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great sent a mission led by St. Augustine to convert the Anglo-Saxons. Augustine landed in Kent in 597 AD and was welcomed by the King of Kent, Ethelbert, whose Frankish wife was already a Christian. This was a brilliant strategic move by the Pope. By converting the king, they hoped to convert the kingdom. The Roman mission was a great success. Augustine founded the first archbishopric in Canterbury, and from there, the Roman form of Christianity began to spread throughout the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. This created a spiritual clash, a tension between the two forms of Christianity. The Roman Church was more centralized and hierarchical, with a clear chain of command leading all the way back to the Pope in Rome. The Celtic Church was more decentralized and monastic. This difference came to a head at the Synod of Whitby in 664 AD, a great council that was called to settle the differences between the two churches. The main point of contention was the date of Easter. After a long debate, the Roman side, represented by Wilfrid, won the day, and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms agreed to adopt the Roman date. This was a pivotal moment. It not only unified the Christian church in England, but also brought the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into the fold of the wider European world. The spread of Christianity was a massive turning point for the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. It brought with it not just a new religion, but a new system of writing, a new legal tradition, and a new way of thinking about the world. It also brought an end to the pagan gods and the old warrior ethos. The kings, once seen as mere war leaders, now claimed a new kind of legitimacy, one that was sanctioned by God Himself. The monasteries that sprang up all over the country became centers of learning and culture, where monks meticulously copied manuscripts and preserved knowledge. The old tribal divisions did not disappear overnight, but the Christian faith provided a new, unifying identity. The island of Britain was slowly but surely becoming a Christian land. With the spread of Christianity, a new political landscape began to take shape, one dominated by a continuous struggle for power among the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. This period, from roughly the 6th to the 9th centuries, is famously known as the Heptarchy, a term that literally means rule of 7. But this number is a bit of a simplification. In reality, there were many more smaller kingdoms and sub-kingdoms, and the number of dominant powers was always in flux. The constant competition for dominance defined this era, creating a complex and often violent tapestry of shifting alliances, betrayals, and conquests. The three most powerful kingdoms were Northumbria in the far north, Mercia in the center, and Wessex in the south. Each kingdom had its moment in the sun, a time when its king, a Bretwalda or Briton ruler, was the most powerful man on the island. Northumbria was the first to rise to prominence in the 7th century under kings like Oswald and Oswiu. It was a center of learning and art, and its monasteries, like Lindisfarne and Wearmouth Jarrow, were beacons of culture in a turbulent time. The Lindisfarne Gospels, a beautifully illuminated manuscript, is a testament to the artistic and intellectual vibrancy of this period. But Northumbria's dominance was short-lived. Its power was eventually eclipsed by the rise of its southern rival, Mercia. Mercia, a kingdom with a great geographic advantage in the heart of England, was the next to dominate. Its most famous king was Offa, who ruled from 757 to 796. Offa was a true empire builder. He expanded Mercian territory, conquered rival kingdoms, and even engaged in diplomatic relations with the great Frankish emperor Charlemagne. His power was so great that he was the first Anglo-Saxon king to be referred to as King of the English in a document, a title that was a long way from the more local King of the Mercians. Offa's most lasting legacy, however, was the construction of Offa's Dyke, a massive earthwork that stretched for over 64 miles along the border with the Welsh kingdoms. It was a profound symbol of his power and a clear marker of the cultural and political divide between the Anglo-Saxons and the native British. But Mercia's dominance, like Northumbria's before it, was not to last. The third and final kingdom to rise to supremacy was Wessex in the southwest. Wessex had been a relatively quiet kingdom for much of the Heptarchy, but under a new line of kings, it began to expand its power. It was a gradual process, but by the 9th century, Wessex was poised to become the most powerful kingdom of all. This was partly due to the relentless pressure from a new set of invaders. The Vikings, who had been raiding for decades, were now coming in much larger numbers, and their presence would be the catalyst for the final unification of England. The Heptarchy period was not just a story of kings and wars. It was a time when a new identity was being forged. The old tribal distinctions were beginning to fade, replaced by a new, shared Anglo-Saxon culture. The Anglo-Saxons were a people of poets and artists, of farmers and craftsmen, and their society, though violent, was a complex and vibrant one. The constant struggle for power among the kingdoms was a kind of crucible, a process that was slowly but surely molding a new nation from the disparate parts of the old. The end of the Heptarchy was not a sad tale of loss, but a story of the birth of something new. Amidst the constant shuffling of power among the Heptarchy kingdoms, one king of Mercia, named Offa, stood out as a true figure of both military might and political savvy. His reign, from 757 to 796, was a period of Mercian dominance, a time when the central kingdom of England held sway over all others. Offa was a ruthless and ambitious ruler, and his actions would forever change the political landscape of the island. He was a master of conquest, and he systematically subdued his neighbors, absorbing their territories and consolidating his power. He defeated the Welsh, the East Angles, and the Kentish, and he even managed to force the West Saxons into submission. For a time, he was the undisputed master of England south of the Humber. But Offa was more than just a military commander. He was a statesman and a diplomat. He engaged in relations with the great powers of the continent, including the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne. The two rulers exchanged letters and gifts, and it is said that Charlemagne, in a letter to Offa, referred to him as his most faithful friend. This was a massive deal, a sign that the king of Mercia was seen as an equal by the most powerful ruler in Europe. It also shows us that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were no longer isolated backwaters. They were a part of the wider European world. Offa's most famous and enduring legacy, however, is not a battle or a treaty. It is a massive earthwork that still stands today, Offa's Dyke. It stretched for over 64 miles from the Dee estuary in the north to the Severn estuary in the south. It wasn't a military wall like Hadrian's wall. It was a clear, unambiguous border, a physical manifestation of the boundary between the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Mercia and the Welsh kingdoms to the west. Historians still debate the exact purpose of the dike. Was it a defensive barrier to stop Welsh raids? Or was it a more symbolic gesture, a way for Offa to assert his dominance and mark the limits of his authority? Most scholars agree that it was a bit of both. It was a clear warning to the Welsh that they were no longer a part of the Anglo-Saxon world, a line that should not be crossed. The construction of the dike was a monumental effort, a project that required a huge amount of labor and organization. It showed the world that Offa was a king with the power and the resources to undertake a project of this scale. It was a profound symbol of his reign, and it would remain a boundary between England and Wales for centuries to come. The dike, with its large ditch and rampart, was a constant, solid presence in the lives of the people who lived on both sides of it. For the Anglo-Saxons, it was a symbol of security and prosperity. For the Welsh, it was a constant reminder of their loss and their subjugation. Offa's reign, while a time of great power and influence for Mercia, was not without its internal struggles. He was a ruthless ruler, and he often resorted to violence to maintain his power. He had his rivals assassinated and his enemies blinded, but for a brief moment, he was the dominant force on the island, a true king of the English. His death in 796 marked the end of Mercian supremacy, and his kingdom would soon fall into decline. But the legacy of his reign, the consolidation of power, the establishment of diplomatic relations with the continent, and the constructions of the Great Dyke would have a lasting impact on the history of Britain. He set the stage for the next great act, a time of even greater change, and as we will soon see, a new and even more terrifying set of invaders. As the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of the Heptarchy vied for supremacy, a new and terrifying threat was emerging from across the North Sea. The sound of their arrival was the sound of a longship's prow scraping on a sandy beach, the splash of a dozen oars hitting the water, and then the terrifying war cries. The Vikings had arrived. The first recorded Viking raid on Britain was in 793 AD on the holy island of Lindisfarne, a center of Anglo-Saxon Christianity and learning. The raid was a complete shock. The monks, who had lived in peace for centuries, were slaughtered or carried off into slavery, and the monastery's treasures were plundered. It was a brutal act that sent a wave of fear and horror throughout the Christian world. The Vikings, who came from modern-day Scandinavia, were not a single unified group. They were a mix of Norsemen and Danes, and they came not just as raiders, but as explorers, traders, and eventually as settlers. Their longships were a marvel of naval engineering, able to cross the treacherous seas and navigate shallow rivers, allowing them to strike deep into the heart of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. For decades, the raids were sporadic and seasonal. The Vikings would arrive in the spring, plunder a coastal monastery or town, and then disappear back across the sea with their loot. The Anglo-Saxon kings, with their internal conflicts and their lack of a navy, were powerless to stop them. But in the mid-9th century, the nature of the Viking threat changed dramatically. The raids were no longer just about plunder, they were about conquest. In 865 AD, a massive Viking force, which the Anglo-Saxons called the Great Heathen Army, landed in East Anglia. This was not a raiding party. This was a full-scale invasion force, a collection of armies under a group of formidable Viking leaders, like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson. Their goal was to conquer the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. They spent the next decade rampaging across the island, systematically defeating one kingdom after another. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, with their fragmented leadership and constant internal bickering, were no match for the united and single-minded Viking army. Northumbria, with its rich monasteries, was the first to fall. The Viking army captured its capital, York, and turned it into a Viking stronghold, a new city known as Jorvik. The Viking army then moved on to Mercia and East Anglia, and one by one, the Anglo-Saxon kings were either killed in battle or forced to pay a heavy tribute known as Danegeld, a kind of protection money. The Viking conquest of these kingdoms was brutal and total. The Anglo-Saxon way of life was either destroyed or forced to adapt. For the first time in centuries, the Anglo-Saxons were on the back foot, fighting for their very survival. By 878 AD, only one Anglo-Saxon kingdom was left standing, a tiny corner of Wessex. It was a dark time for the Anglo-Saxon people. Their world was on the brink of extinction, their kings were dead or in hiding, and their land was being colonized by a new, powerful, and pagan enemy. The old way of life, which had been so carefully built over centuries, was in danger of being wiped out forever. But the story of the Anglo-Saxons was not yet over. The tiny kingdom of Wessex had a king, a young man who was about to rise to the occasion, and in doing so, save his people and his culture from the Vikings. His name was Alfred, and his resistance would be a turning point, not just for Wessex, but for the future of the entire island. With the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of the north and east conquered, the great heathen army set its sights on its final target, the small but resilient kingdom of Wessex. At its head was the young and determined King Alfred. His reign, which began in 871 AD, was not a story of easy victories, but a long, grinding struggle against a powerful and relentless enemy. The Vikings, having already defeated every other Anglo-Saxon kingdom, saw Wessex as the final prize, the last piece of the puzzle. They launched a series of invasions, pushing Alfred and his forces to the brink of defeat. The Danes were a formidable force, and for a time it seemed as if the entire island would be lost to them. In 878 AD, after a surprise attack, Alfred was forced to flee. He became a fugitive, hiding in the marshes of Somerset with a small band of followers. This was the lowest point of his reign, a time of profound despair. It was during this period that the famous story of Alfred and the burnt cakes is said to have occurred, a charming but likely fictional tale that nevertheless illustrates his desperation. But Alfred was not a man to give up easily. He used this time to regroup, to plan, and to gather his strength. He built a network of fortifications known as burhs, which were a key part of his new strategy. These burhs were not just military fortresses, they were also fortified towns that served as centers of commerce and a place of refuge for the civilian population. They were a brilliant innovation, a way to defend the kingdom while also rebuilding the economy and the social structure. After a few months in hiding, Alfred emerged from the marshes and rallied his forces. The final showdown came at the Battle of Edington in 878 AD. It was a decisive and complete victory for the Anglo-Saxons. Alfred's army, unified and disciplined, defeated the Viking army led by King Guthrum. The victory was so total that Guthrum and his men were forced to surrender. Alfred, in an act of statesmanship that was as brilliant as his military strategy, did not just kill them. He made a peace treaty, the Treaty of Wedmore, which divided England between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings. The Vikings were allowed to keep the territory they had already conquered, which was known as the Danelaw, while Alfred retained control of Wessex. Guthrum, in a final act of submission, converted to Christianity, with Alfred as his godfather. Alfred's victory at Edington was a pivotal moment in English history. It was the first time an Anglo-Saxon king had not just repelled the Vikings, but had also forced them to negotiate. It saved the Anglo-Saxon culture from extinction and laid the groundwork for the eventual unification of England. Alfred was not content with just military victories. He was a man of letters, a scholar who believed that a strong kingdom was also a wise one. He promoted education, translated important Latin works into Old English, and commissioned the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a historical record that gives us much of what we know about this period. He was a true hero, a king who did not just fight for his kingdom, but also for its culture and its history. He was the first Anglo-Saxon king to be called the Great, a title that was well deserved. The story of Alfred's resistance is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, A single person can change the course of history. He turned a desperate fight for survival into a long-term strategy for success. His legacy was not just a kingdom, but a nation. He had saved the Anglo-Saxon people from being absorbed by the Vikings, and in doing so, he had laid the foundations for a new, united England. The old tribal divisions were beginning to fade, and a new sense of a single English identity was beginning to emerge. While the Anglo-Saxons of Wessex, under King Alfred, were fighting for their survival against the Vikings, the last vestiges of the ancient British tribal kingdoms were fighting their own desperate battles on the western edges of the island. These were the kingdoms of Cornwall and Strathclyde, the final strongholds of the native British people. For centuries, they had managed to hold on, isolated from the rest of the Anglo-Saxon world, preserving their language and their culture. But the Anglo-Saxon and Viking expansions were like an inexorable tide, and their eventual absorption was inevitable. The Kingdom of Cornwall, a small peninsula in the southwest, was a place of rugged beauty and a deep Celtic heritage. Its people, the Cornish, spoke a language that was closely related to Welsh and Breton. They had managed to maintain their independence for centuries, surviving in the face of constant pressure from the powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex. The border between Cornwall and Wessex was a source of constant conflict, with raids and skirmishes happening all the time. But the Cornish, with their knowledge of the land and their fierce fighting spirit, were a hard people to conquer. They were the last British kingdom in what we now call England, a final defiant outpost of the old ways. The Kingdom of Strathclyde was a British kingdom in the northwest, in what is now southern Scotland and northern England. Its people were also of British descent, and their kingdom was a final pocket of Celtic culture, surrounded by the powerful Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria and the rising power of the Picts. They too were a warrior people, and they had managed to hold on for centuries, fighting for their survival against both their Anglo-Saxon and Viking neighbors. They were a vital link between the Welsh kingdoms to the south and the Pictish kingdoms to the north. Their existence was a reminder that the old British world had not completely disappeared. The end for these kingdoms was not a sudden, dramatic event. It was a slow, grinding process of attrition and assimilation. For Cornwall, the end came in the 9th century, when it was eventually absorbed by the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex. The Cornish language and culture, however, did not disappear overnight. It lingered for centuries, a final echo of a lost world. The Cornish, despite their political subjugation, held on to their identity, and even today, there is a strong sense of Cornish pride and a revived interest in their ancient language. The end of Strathclyde was even more complex. It was a series of slow military defeats and political marriages that eventually led to its absorption by the new kingdom of Alba, the kingdom of the Scots. The people of Strathclyde were a mix of British and Gaelic people, and their culture was a blend of both traditions. Their eventual integration into the Scottish kingdom was a final chapter in the long and complex story of the British people. The last remnants of the old British tribal kingdoms had been absorbed, and a new, more unified political landscape was emerging on the island. The old tribal identities had been replaced by a new, more powerful sense of national identity. The map of Britain, which had been a patchwork of small, warring kingdoms for centuries, was now a story of a few powerful players. The story of these final strongholds is a sad but important one. They were the last defiant outposts of a once great people. They were a final reminder that the history of Britain is not just the story of the Anglo-Saxons. It is also the story of the ancient Britons, the people who were here before the Romans and who fought to hold on to their land and their culture against overwhelming odds. Their spirit, their language, and their memory live on in the place names, the legends, and the hearts of the people who still call themselves British today. The story of the ancient British tribal kingdoms, from their early beginnings to their final strongholds, was now reaching its conclusion. The long and complex history of the island, once a patchwork of independent tribes, was slowly but surely being woven into a single, unified narrative. The old way of life was fading into memory, and a new one was taking its place. The final chapter for these ancient kingdoms was not a glorious final battle, but a slow, gradual absorption into the new, more powerful kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons and the Scots. The old tribal identity, based on kinship and local loyalty, was being replaced by a new national identity, one that was forged in the fires of conquest and the long, hard struggle for survival. The process of unification was a direct consequence of the Viking invasions. The great heathen army, as we've seen, had laid waste to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, forcing the survivors to either submit or unite. The fear of a common enemy, a powerful and relentless foe, was a great motivator. King Alfred of Wessex, with his brilliant military and political mind, had shown that a united front was the only way to survive. His descendants, a line of powerful and ambitious kings, would continue his work, slowly but surely expanding the territory of Wessex and bringing the other kingdoms under their control. They were not just fighting the Vikings, they were fighting for the very soul of the island. They were building a new nation on the ruins of the old. The old tribal kingdoms had no place in this new world. They were too small, too fragmented, and too weak to stand against the powerful new forces that were emerging. The Welsh kingdoms, though they had held on for centuries, were now confined to the mountainous western peninsula, a land of their own, but a land that was increasingly on the defensive. The Picts, in the north, had been absorbed into the new kingdom of Alba, which would eventually become Scotland. The ancient British people, the original inhabitants of the island, were now a minority, their language and their culture pushed to the fringes. The Anglo-Saxons had won the day, and their culture, their language, and their laws were now the dominant force on the island. The end of this era marked a profound shift in the history of Britain. The focus of the story was no longer on a collection of disparate tribal kingdoms, but on a few powerful nations: England, Scotland, and Wales. The old names, the Iceni, the Brigantes, the Caratacus, were no longer the names of living, breathing kingdoms. They were names from the past, echoes of a lost world. The memory of their struggles, their triumphs, and their defeats would live on in the folklore and the poetry of the people, but their political power was gone forever. The map of Britain had been redrawn, and the future of the island would be a story of these three nations, their conflicts, and their eventual, often difficult, coexistence. This was not a tragedy, not in the classical sense. It was the natural course of history, a process of evolution and change. The old had to make way for the new. The fragmented, warring tribal kingdoms, while full of brave warriors and proud leaders, were simply not equipped to survive in a world of powerful, centralized nations. The legacy of these ancient kingdoms would live on, not in their political structures, but in the very identity of the people. The resilience of the British, the artistry of the Picts, the fierce independence of the Welsh. These were all things that would continue to shape the character of the island for centuries to come. The old kingdoms had died, but their spirit, in a way, had been reborn. And so, we come to the end of our long journey through a time of forgotten kingdoms, a history that is less a set of facts and more a gentle hum of memory. The ancient British tribal systems, with their fierce chieftains and their sacred groves, have long since passed away, their struggles and their triumphs absorbed into a new story. The echoes of their world can still be found if you listen closely. They are in the names of the places you know, like the River Thames, which takes its name from a Celtic word, or London, which was a Roman name for a much older Celtic settlement. Their legends, like that of King Arthur, are still whispered in the mists of the Welsh hills, a timeless tale of a hero who will one day return. And their spirit, a stubborn and defiant love of freedom, lives on in the hearts of the British people, a legacy that is as strong and as unshakable as the stones of Stonehenge. The Roman roads, once so straight and true, are now but faint lines on the land, and the great Roman walls are home to sheep and wild flowers. The Anglo-Saxon halls of wood and thatch have long since crumbled into dust, and the Vikings' longships are now silent in their watery graves. The ancient barrows and burial mounds of the Bronze Age people still stand, silent sentinels watching over a land that has changed so much since their time. The stories of these people, 1,000 years of history, are not over. They are not forgotten. They have simply faded into the legend, a part of the long, slow rhythm of time. The sun, which has set on their kingdoms, is now setting on our journey together. Their stories are now a gentle whisper in the wind, a calming rhythm in the quiet of the night. Their wars are long over, their triumphs long past. And so, the story of a forgotten people sinks into legend, a part of the long, deep dream of history. The old kingdoms are at peace, and you can be too. The long journey is over. There is nothing left to do but drift off to sleep. The stories of kings and queens, of warriors and poets, have found their quiet ending. All is quiet. All is still. Just peace.